what exists in countries, what can we develop in terms of being able to develop financial and institutional approaches that can deliver the conservation outcomes, because that's one of the things we're looking at here is actually delivering conservation on the ground. And yeah, I think it's also really important to keep in mind that if you look at the various BBOP principles that are guiding us, one of the things that we look at, as we look at the viability of these offsets is the idea of permanence. How do you make these offsets last? So how does that occur within the planning process, the type of institutional structures in place to make that happen? So we're fortunate today that we have various representatives who are actually in the field trying to put these systems in place. So we're going to start our discussions around management agreements and how management agreements work in terms of working with different types of landholders to deliver conservation. So Michael Crowe will be our first speaker. Michael, if you could do a quick introduction and do your presentation, and he'll be followed by George Kelly.
Thanks, Ray. Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Crowe. I had experience working with the state of Victoria down in Australia in developing and applying management agreements. These agreements were between the government and landowners, and their aim was to secure and ensure the ongoing management of offsets. So I'm just going to do a bit of basic stuff. About management agreements. So it's a contract. It's a legal contract between a principal and an offset provider, and it's a fairly useful tool because it does enable you to implement a number of the basic principles of biodiversity offsetting. So first of those is about the security of the offset. So the contract's giving you legal security over the land on which the offset is sitting. It can address the duration of the offset. This is usually permanent, and the addition or the inclusion of a covenant within the agreement is what enables a management agreement, the contract, to become permanent. And George is going to talk more about covenants in a few minutes. It enables the gain side of the no net loss equation to be documented and put in place. So the management agreement is going to address the commitments and the actions that the landowner has to take on the offset, and in turn these commitments and these actions are the things from which the gain is derived. It also addresses or can address the like-for-like feature. So the contract's going to say where the offset is. So this is then going to come back to if there's a vicinity like-for-like criterion. That's how that is documented. And of course, it will describe the particular type of habitat or perhaps the species that the offset is addressed. So these are key things for the like-for-like policy. This is okay. That's right. Okay. So I just want to talk now about if you're setting out to prepare a management agreement for an offset, some of the things that you might like to think about. First one there is about the distribution of risk, and there are a couple of concepts, adverse selection, moral hazard, that come out of economic theory and apply to contracts, and they're related to this asymmetry of information. So it's a saying that both parties don't have the same information, and if you're on the principal side of a contract, of this particular type of management agreement, these are things you need to think about, because it's likely that the offset provider knows some things that you don't know, and there are ways in which you can mitigate these risks, and typical ones, for example, are doing some due diligence on the prospective provider. You can also build into the agreement features such as progress payments or credit release. In Victoria, we use progress payments. I think in the United States wetland mitigation, they use credit release over the years. So this is basically saying it's a way to ensure that the provider fulfills the contract by holding back the benefits until certain milestones have been reached. You need to think about what your performance measures in the agreement will be. The two major choices are on inputs or on outcomes. Now, there's an attraction in saying that we'll base the agreement performance on the agreement on outcomes. It's in Victoria we didn't do that. We actually base it on inputs, and that's really just a practical matter, that the biodiversity outcomes on an offset site are, well, number one, they're subject to a lot of other influences. So you can get natural variation due to the changes of climate, or variations in climate, other external factors that are outside the control of the landowner. So the outcomes can be quite slow in becoming manifest. So it might be 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years before a site actually starts to respond. So it's sort of the ideal way to do it, but it's not very practical, and usually you come back to thinking about inputs. In other words, has the landowner undertaken the actions and the commitments that are written in the agreement? You need to think also about transaction costs. So if you're doing a number of these agreements in a repetitive way, this has to be a fairly smooth, streamlined system. If it was one big project, well, you can probably get the lawyers involved and spend a bit more money. Well, that's my 6 minutes, and thank you, and I'll finish there.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Sorry, I have one more slide. Yeah, this is a bit tricky. So this is just quickly on the contents. You need to obviously talk about the parties, what the commitments are, the management plan embedded in the agreement, so that, for example, if there's a change of ownership, and under the covenant, the new owner will be bound by the agreement, and they need to understand quite clearly what the management plan is. Specification of the offset, I spoke about that in terms of like for like and vicinity. The reporting and monitoring and enforcement provisions, obviously very important, because this is the main tool that we're going to use for compliance. So thank you, and I'll finish there.
Thank you, Michael. George.
Okay, I'm a brief supplement to Michael, and I'm George Kelly with EBX. We've done over 90 mitigation projects, and what I'm most proud about is we have over 400 conservation easements associated with that, which means there's landowners that have conservation easements on those particular projects. Briefly, in terms of the management side of the equation, as I mentioned in other panels, what happened in the United States is in 2008, when the federal mitigation rules came in place, they basically said there shall be equivalent standards for all forms of mitigation. So there are three forms of mitigation: permittee responsible, mitigation banking, and in lieu fees. And what had happened earlier is that there were differential standards for those three types of practices. And what the new rule primarily did was said, we want to create equivalent standards. And as part of this, any project that gets approval is going to have a mitigation plan approved. And there are 12 elements to that mitigation plan, and I'll briefly just walk through that. And then some of these elements we're going to come back to in more detail. You have to state your objectives and your goals, because that typically defines your performance standards. You have to identify why that site was selected. And normally, the new rules basically are saying, particularly as it relates to wetlands and streams, that any site has to be selected in the context of a watershed approach. Site protection instrument, we're going to talk about that, but has to be permanent protection. Baseline information, that has to be identified as part of defining what the ecological uplift of your work is. Determination of credits, that can be regionally varied depending on where you are, but basically there has to be some kind of calculation as to how those credits are derived. Your mitigation work plan, are you going to be restoring, enhancing, creating? Are you going to be putting vegetative plots? Where are you going to be putting them? Are you going to have plan sheets for that? Maintenance plan, what are you going to do in contingency dynamics? What happens with respect to that? Performance standards, this is a big one, and this is, I think Morgan Robertson mentioned it yesterday, about what are we measuring? And this is where I pay attention. This is where economically I have financial assurances tied to this. What's my success criteria? Typically for wetlands, it's vegetative and hydrology. For stream, and there's a pattern, profile, and dimension issues with stream that are physically monitored that we are held accountable to. Monitoring requirements, it's typically a 5 to 10 year period, and basically you're monitoring for the performance standard criteria. So whatever the performance standards that are defined, you're monitoring for those performance standards. Long-term management plan, this is something I'll also talk about in the next session. But now there's a long-term stewardship requirement. So as I mentioned, we have a 5 to 10 year monitoring requirement. After we conclude that, we then turn that over to a long-term store. And there has to be a long-term management plan associated with that stewardship. Adaptive management, and then the final thing is financial assurances. So financial assurances relate to the issues of performance primarily, and saying to the extent I don't perform, then the regulatory agency can approve. So briefly, who approves it? It is, if it's in a bank context, it's typically the regulatory agency that approves. These approval processes take anywhere up to 1 to 3 years. And we don't get our credits released all at once. We get them incrementally released. So only as we perform do we get them released, and the monitoring reports reflect how we get that credits to be released. So with that, I think I've over my time, and I'll come back to you later.
Thanks, George. Well, just when he says later, we're actually going to be talking about, management agreements now. We're going to be talking later on a little bit about covenants and all. So you've heard a presentation, 2 regulatory environments, trying to structure these agreements from through regulation in Australia and the United States. So we're going to move on to a quick discussion about some opportunities and experiences in France, and then we're going to open it up for some questions on these management agreements, so we can get some, so we can clarify any questions that you have. So I'd like to invite Vincent Hulin to present right now. Introduce yourself.
Good morning, I'm Vincent Hulin. I'm head of research in CDC Biodiversité, which is a French private enterprise, which is part of the group Caisse des Dépôts. We only have in France one habitat bank. It is the first and the only one since 2008. And the first question I was asked was, how do we do with the landowner of this habitat bank? And it's a bit easy because the landowner, it is us. So we are the only landowners of the entire area of this habitat bank. So things are a bit easy on this point. And so we have two types of agreements. The first one and the most important one is with the French government. This agreement approves COSUR, which is the name of this habitat bank. It approves COSUR as an habitat bank in France for one type of ecosystem, the Coussou, and for some kind of species, protected species that we can find on this habitat. And it approves this bank for 30 years. And it approves, it permits CDC Biodiversité to sell biodiversity units to implement offset for project owners. In this agreement, French state has some obligations, and he has to control the sales of biodiversity units. And by control, I mean also the price of these biodiversity units. We are not the only decisionaire about the price of these units. We have to describe what this price includes. French state also has to organize the governance about this bank. It has to control their ecological restoration that we are undertaking on this ecosystem, and we have to, CDC Biodiversité have to monitor ecological restoration success, and the French state has to control this monitoring and the data we gather. CDC Biodiversité also has some obligations, so we have to undertake all, the agreement says that we have to undertake all the management methods to restore the Coussou as soon as possible. As it's a very particular type of ecosystem, it's a bit difficult to do this very soon, but we have to do all what we can. To do that, we have contracts with the managers of a natural resource, which is just near our bank. And we are cooperating for the management of our ecosystems. And we have contracts with farmers, local farmers, because this ecosystem needs cattle to be on it, to be restored. We also have to monitor and to gather data. We have to communicate about these data to demonstrate that ecological restoration is a success. We have to maintain the habitat banking for 30 years, but our agreement with the French state also says that we have to maintain ecological objectives of this bank after these 30 years. This agreement doesn't say how to do it, so we are in discussion with the French state. But we have to maintain ecological objectives and the ecological state of this bank after the bank has disappeared. The way we sell biodiversity units, it's under strict control of French government, because we cannot sell biodiversity units to any project owners. When a project owner has an impact on Coussou, French state tells him that he has to restore Coussou to do offsets. The project owners can restore Coussou on his own or buy biodiversity units to this bank. It is his own choice. And when the project owners wants to buy biodiversity units, the French government has to agree with that and to agree to the sales and its price. So all stages of biodiversity unit sales are under strict control of French government. That's why some economists say that this habitat banking is not market at all, because there is a strict control of public government. So I think that's all about this point. Yeah, another question was, do we take advantage of some experience in US or Australia or other countries to write our agreements? Of course, we have some experience in other countries, but as the situation is very particular in France, as I told you, Our agreements are very particular, and I don't think it is generalizable to other countries. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vincent. So just before we open up to questions, I think it's important to recognize that with these performance-based agreements, one of the opportunities when looking at the design, after you design your offset or when you're designing your offset and you want to implement it, that there's a possibility of engagement with private sector. When I say private sector, I mean with landowners. I mean, we could look at, in many developing countries, where there may be some performance payments that could go in terms of paying farmers contracts for managing their land in a certain way, for doing restoration, for communities to actually manage a certain level of forests. So not only do biodiversity offsets mean a certain level of protection, but can actually stimulate a lot of support for conservation and bringing in income into local communities. In fact, one of the questions, I'll just use the prerogative of the chair and ask a question, because you've heard of European cases here. Luis Honwana from Mozambique. And Luis, a quick question. These kinds of performance payments, are they used in Mozambique? Do you have experience with those? Do these types of things be able to work in the context of offsetting in a Mozambican context?
Well, I think they'll be effective, but not now, when time comes. We are still in a very early stage of development in this process, and we think that we need to resort to forms more simple, more direct, of making sure that both the regulation and the payment and the whole system is first understood, and second, efficient in our particular conditions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Ben?
Thank you, Ben. Just a couple of clarifications and then a question for you, George. The clarification, Michael, you said that in the contract that's developed, there is an assignment of rights. And I suppose that the company that's doing the development and thus making the offset, their right is to obtain credit. But then, George, you said that the credit is only released over time. What is that credit? Is the credit actually release from your regulatory obligations to do it? I mean, what is this? And I guess my overriding question is, what is assigned in the contract in terms of the right to the proponent, to the developer?
Okay, so just to clarify, the agreement is actually between the government and the landowner. It's a statutory agreement. Apart from all the other content, the agreement will document a number of credits that will be owned by the landowner in fulfilling the contract. Now, the landowner can then sell those credits to any developer. The developer is looking for an offset, so the developer will buy the appropriate credits. Now, the credits are, I mean, they're not a piece of land or anything. They're just, if you like, a right to say they've got that offset. So the landowner retains all ownership and obligations about the land, and this sort of virtual credit is bought by the developer, who then presents it to the regulatory authority in fulfilment of their offset, pays or negotiates with the landowner for the price, and that money is progressively paid under the contract under progress payments. So there's no ongoing relationship between the developer and the landowner. The developer fulfills his obligations once he's presented the credits.
And then in our instance, it's a little different in the sense that this mitigation banking instrument defines the crediting. And that basically is run by what we call a bank sponsor, a company like ourselves. We in turn work with the landowners to deliver the product. And under law, liability is transferred to us for success. So the developer, once they buy a credit, is done. Now, with respect to credit releases, what we mean by that is you only are authorized, let's say I have 100 acres of wetlands and I restore all 100 and I get 100 credits. Then I may get 10% released when I sign the instrument. So that means 10 credits are released for sale. Doesn't mean they're sold, but that's what we mean by release. They're released over time as milestone success criteria are met.
Thank you. I didn't understand really the role of the developer, but it's clear now. And just a question for you, George, because I don't know the situation in Australia. In Alberta, where I'm from, the hunter groups are some of our best conservationists in the province. Have you, in your experience, found that the hunting groups are helpful? Are they involved in the process at all? And if so, could you describe?
Yeah, we deal with a lot of hunting and ranching lands and also ag lands. Those are the three largest types of products that we work with in terms of restoration opportunities. And we work with a lot of hunting groups as it relates to, a lot of times they don't own the land, they lease it from the owner. And so but the hunting groups actually help us in the management side because oftentimes there's trespass and other dynamics where hunting may still be allowed under the conditions that we have. For example, we create a wetland, we put an easement on that, hunting is still allowed, consistent with the trails that are there. So they can be a very active kind of assurance that they're not, on the management and encroachment side of the equation. And then to the extent the hunting groups own the land, they're very interested in enhancing habitat. And sometimes our particular mitigation plan will be oriented towards creating more mass-producing species for turkey hunting or pheasant hunting or the like. So to the extent we can be compatible, we have been.
Right.
Sure.
Just to add one more point about, I think part of your question was what are these credits? And when we started signing these agreements, we did get some inquiries from the lawyers of the landowners and the developers asking that question, what are these credits? What are they? I mean, have they got any legal substance other than within the agreement? And so it comes down to, at least in our jurisdiction, as to whether they're property or not. And ours are not property, sort of, in the legal sense. But it's certainly another consideration if you're having a scheme like this as to whether, in fact, and you would probably need another bit of legislation to make these credits property. And I mean, the Victorian scheme operates quite well without that, but it's a matter of, I suppose, legal comfort for the participants that they actually have a meaning in law beyond a sort of an administrative convenience.
Otherwise, you make a market.
Well, the market kind of operates, but it depends upon everybody's confidence that the department or the agency stands behind them. If it sort of got out of the administrative section into the judicial section, they would kind of they'd be just thin air, if you like. So, but it's a bit of a nicety in a way.
Okay. Yes.
Thanks. A couple of long-term questions. For the financial assurances, do y'all set up a trust fund or a surety bond or something to make sure it goes? And to assure it, do you have to have a third-party accountant or some third party verify that it's all good?
In terms of, and I'm going to get into endowments and trust funds a little later on in our discussion on conservation easements and the long-term stewardship. But in terms of financial assurances, that's particularly tied to doing the work that you say you're going to do. And that typically is a performance bond underwritten by sureties. There also is a new insurance product out there that is evolving, and where you can do letters of credit and the like. So that is typically tied to either the value of the construction. So let's go back to my example of 100 credits. Let's say I'm selling them for $50,000 an acre, or $50,000 a credit. Sometimes the construction's a lot less than that, and so you'll come up with a construction dollar figure to say that's the extent of your performance bond. Sometimes they require a performance bond for 100% of the credits, which doesn't make sense to us because we think there's a lot of protections already. But that just means these credits become more expensive. So it's really tied to performance of the work, and I'll get into the endowments on the other side.
I know this is a really complicated question, but I'd like the panelists to give me a one-word answer. Using your experience and wisdom, what do we measure? Is it input or outcome?
Can you amplify that when you say?
I mean, Michael teed the question up. When you're setting these management plans, you have options. Do you try and drive input that set the land management for the farmer or the landowner, or do you just set an outcome measure? Do you tell the farmer we want grazing and it's 3 cows per acre, or do you say we want orchids? Do you set your performance standards? Is it input or outcome?
Can I, while you're thinking, George, can I have a little go at that? I mean, I think it depends somewhat on the nature of the offset. So in the Victorian system, most of our offsets are located on existing native vegetation, which is obviously complex and subject to, lots of other influences and variations. So in that context, and we're looking for an uplift in quality. That's the objective. In that context, performance on outcome is difficult, as I explained. However, and George might comment on this, if you're doing more of a constructed offset that might involve building channels and reconstructing banks and damming wetlands and whatever it is, that seems to me to be more amenable to outcomes. In other words, have you done the construction that's in the plan? In our context, we also have a variation where we have an offset option that's to do with revegetation, so replanting. Now that is amenable to outcomes because what you're asked to do is to replant 30 different species in this density and to get such and such a survival. So that would be, you can go out 2 years later and look at it and see if it's happened and there is the outcome there. So I think,
You're not going to answer my question.
well, I think the answer, my one-word answer would be, it depends.
2 words.
2 words.
Agreed. In the U.S., we're heavily restoration focused. It's outcome based. Now, the question could relate to, is it relating to our role vis-a-vis the government or our role with the landowner? As it relates to the landowner, we're typically just dealing with the landowner and saying, we want to use your land for these purposes. And it's not outcome based. But as it relates to the U.S. approach, I mean, we have monitoring wells that monitor the hydrology. We have vegetative plots that measure the number of trees. We have overbank flooding events for streams. We have in-stream biology for benthic macroinvertebrates. We have all these things, and they're actually very explicit standards. You will meet 7% of the hydrology within a foot of the surface for 12.5% of the growing season. That's one example of the hydrology requirement. So very outcome-based.
And you don't regret, looking back with hindsight, you don't regret using outcomes when it would have been easier to use inputs or vice versa. There's no lessons learned from how it's been going.
I think there's a lot of regret, but on the flip side, what I do like as somebody that's investing millions of dollars in these projects is I have assurance of what I'm going to be held accountable to. And the last thing we want is kind of vagaries on that side of the equation. And the other thing is we've helped through analytics improve those performance standards over time to say, you know what, we can't achieve these, we can achieve those. These can really be measured, these cannot be. These are practical things that we should be measuring for. So we've helped advance that.
Thank you. John, one question there.
I'm still struggling to understand the mitigation banking and how it actually implements it home locally. I'm thinking of possibly a financial bank that looks at the developer and the developer kind of deposits a certain bond with some money, and then if you don't do the mitigation, then the person who is affected takes the money. Is that how it works? And I want to understand it properly so that when I go back, I need to do the same.
I think, so we said there's 3 types of mitigation in the U.S. And what you're talking about, I think, is what we call permittee responsible. So that's the developer doing their own mitigation. And in that instance, I think what you're saying is they bond to you, and if they don't do the work, then you can exercise on that bond. And that would be the case for permittee responsible. So they still have that right to do that. They still have to follow those 12 steps, though. They can't avoid those 12 steps. So anybody doing mitigation has to follow those 12 steps. The difference between mitigation banking, though, is mitigation banking is typically done in advance, and it's for more than just one project. And it's typically done by third-party entities like ourselves. So we, in turn, we will go out and do a larger scale restoration, for example, get approval under this mitigation banking instrument, and then get credits released under the mitigation plan that I mentioned again. And as part of that, we have a bonding requirement to the government. And then when we sell credits to the developer, and the developer's done, and then the government deals with that third-party banker in that instance. So the main difference between banking and permittee responsible is that banking's done in advance, used for multiple purposes, and the liability is transferred to the bank sponsor. So now the government's dealing with somebody who spends their livelihood doing these projects. Does that help at all? I still see some uncertainty in the.
Well, you know, John, I think the case is, for example, what we're looking at here in the United States, and what George is referring to, and also Michael, is that there are laws passed in those countries requiring all developers to offset certain type of activities, and so, or in a wetland case, or if it's an impact on species or native vegetation, as Michael said. And they're required to do that, so that allows people to actually invest and actually create these banks ahead of time. In the case of some, like in your country, where there is no regulatory requirements yet, there is no incentive for people to create those types of banks. You would create different types of offsets there where you could use a permitting system. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we, toward the end of the session. I want to move on now to a little discussion on conservation covenants or easements or servitude that run with land to create these permanent conditions. And we're going to hear again from the 3 speakers. And I think you're first, George. No, am I right? Yes, you are.
Okay, there's no slides on this one, but remember the 12 steps. And I mentioned step 3 is site protection instrument, and then step 10 is long-term stewardship. And these are the things I want to talk about a little bit more. So site protection instruments, they're permanent in nature. So what in order to get a credit, so when I go through this mitigation plan approval process, in order to get my credits released, I have to have that easement in place on the land before I can get any crediting. So that's a keystone issue. Easement has to be in place before credits are issued. The types, what we're talking about in permanency is typically something called a conservation easement or restrictive covenant. And the difference between the two is conservation easements are held by third parties, folks like Nature Conservancy, Conservation Fund, local land trust typically hold these easements. and basically ensure the integrity of what we're talking about, and I'll walk through some of the elements. Restrictive covenant allows the landowner just to say, I will restrict these uses, and I will record this in the land record. But there is no third party that holds that. So there is a difference, and both are allowed, but there is a preference for conservation easements under the crediting system. To the extent that we have third parties hold it, we get more credits. To the extent that the landowner just puts a restrictive covenant on it, less credits. Again, the point is they're recorded in the land records and they run with the land. So anybody, if they sell that land, this restriction is retained. So what are the major elements of these restrictions? They're in perpetuity. They run with the land. They don't allow public access. So that's a big issue for a lot of our landowners. A lot of farmers, hunters, fishermen say, I don't want the public traipsing all over my property, and this doesn't allow for that. And then the primary elements is that they limit the use of that land to be consistent with that mitigation project. So we mentioned earlier, hunting and fishing are typically allowed. But things like cultivation, if you're cropping, and we're taking those crops out of existence, and we're putting in a new wetland system, you're not going to be able to come back and crop. You're not going to be able to develop. You're not going to be able to put any kind of structures in there, typically. Sometimes they allow structures that are consistent with the overall goal of that mitigation project. So let's say it's a hunting shack that allows for hunting and fishing. That might be allowed so long as you recognize that into the easement. A big issue is timbering, and this is a big question. For example, when we do reforestation for wetland projects, there's a question about can we timber? What happens if trees fall down? And can we do selective harvesting? And certain states in the U.S. will say absolutely no harvesting, nothing. And then some will say selective harvesting. And the reason why the ones that have said no, do nothing, is because they think it's a management issue. If you start allowing people in there to do some harvesting, there's a concern about who's going to be monitoring that, how do we manage that in perpetuity, because that's a big concern. Mineral rights has been a big issue. We work in the Appalachian region of the U.S., among other places, and there's a lot of fracking going on, a lot of coal mining. And most of those sites are underlain by mineral rights that are very old. And some of those, we can't even find the old mineral right owners. And so there's a big question about if we put an easement, does that mean we have to eliminate those mineral rights? Do we have to find that mineral right owner? Because we're dealing with a surface right owner, but we're not dealing with the underground surface right owner. And that's been a big question. So in the Appalachian region, the conclusion was because there's so many unknown mineral rights, because we think it would be prohibitive for you to eliminate that as part of this easement, we're going to allow you just to put an easement on the surface right. And to the extent that mineral right owner comes back later and affects the surface, they're going to have to mitigate the mitigation project. Some states, though, say absolutely not. You've got to extinguish the mineral rights as well and as part of the easement. So it depends where you are, and I think the mineral-rich states tend to allow more flexibility on this issue. Taxes, this is a big question for us with a lot of landowners. Once we put an easement on the land, a lot of times we will reduce property taxes. So a lot of states in the U.S. allow for the property taxes to be reduced because of this conservation use. And then there's questions about, for the landowner, if I sell an easement to you, it's basically treated as an interest in land, and they have to pay for capital gains in the U.S. on that issue. So it's as if they're selling an interest in the land from that perspective. And then we get into estate taxes, and there's some real estate tax benefits in the U.S. that also makes it attractive, not just the landowner getting paid for this easement, but also some tax benefits. The big thing is we do wetland, stream, and endangered species banking in the U.S. When you're talking about the area restricted, you're limited to only the area where the project occurs. So let's take our stream mitigation. A lot of times that's doing stream restoration work and taking corridors 50 feet on either side and saying that's our eased area. So areas outside of that are not subject to these restrictions, and that's a big thing for some of the landowners. So a lot of instances where we've done stream mitigation, the landowners can still cultivate in some of those valleys. Sometimes, though, there are provisions and easements that said to the extent that you have impacts on hydrology, even though it's outside of the easement area, we may limit that. Because again, we look at the performance criteria of the project in question. Enforcement, if it's a conservation easement, it's a third party enforce. So if it's that third party will come in and enforce. And if it's a restrictive covenant, the agencies have the right, the governmental agencies have the right under that document. So we were talking a little bit about endowment, and the question is, if I have a conservation easement, I have to make sure, if I'm working with a nature conservancy, for example, and they hold my easement, I'm going to have to pay them for the right to hold it. They've got to ensure that they've got adequate coverage to enforce that easement in perpetuity. And this can get expensive. And so that's another part of this in terms of the easements. Quickly, public lands. And I know a lot of you deal with public lands issues. There's a question about, well, if we apply these standards to private lands, shouldn't these same restrictions apply to public lands? And it's a big issue in the U.S. because a lot of folks want to use public lands for mitigation. And what the new rules basically say is you've got to meet the standards. And so to the extent you're a park and you already exist and it's part of your planning process and you can't meet some of these objectives, you can't do the mitigation. Some parks are really nominal parks where they don't have the protections in place, and therefore there could be some opportunities in that situation. Finally, long-term stewardship is different from easements, and this is why our credits get so expensive. So I have an easement that restricts the land use, but then long-term stewardship relates to the mitigation work plan. And it goes back to, I said, I've got 5 to 10 years of monitoring. Once the government agencies sign off, then we have to have a long-term steward say, we're going to manage this project consistent with the work plan, and we're going to create a management plan, and we're going to endow that as well. So we take the annual cost of that management plan, and then we do a discount rate to figure out what the total endowment should be. And it can get very large. And again, then we have to build all of these endowments, all these costs, and boil it down into one cost per credit.
Thank you, George. Michael.
Well, I just want to add briefly a couple of points about covenants as they're used in Victoria. So the good news is that the covenant is the management agreement, and the management agreement is the covenant. So we only have the one document. The management agreement is a covenant by virtue that it is a statutory agreement under a piece of legislation that says the Secretary of the Department can enter into an agreement with a landowner, and that agreement can be placed on the title of the land. And in effect, it is then a covenant over the land. Now, so that's very useful in that it sort of simplifies a lot of the process. You just have the one document that serves all purposes in terms of the management and the security of the land. However, it does require that you have this instrument, statutory agreement, sort of on the books, or either on the books or you do some new legislation if that's the way you want to go. Just the other point I want to make, and it's one where we tripped up a bit. George mentioned the offset site will just be a particular piece of land. So it's the same situation. It will typically be a part of a farm or a land holding, and it's not going to line up with the title boundaries. So when we came to inquire about registering our agreements down at the titles office, and we had our map of the offset site, which was sort of just done with the officer with a GPS unit and taking waypoints, we quickly discovered that that didn't meet the surveying standards of the title office, and it actually took us a long time to working with the titles office to be able to translate our maps of the offset site into a much stricter version that would satisfy the titles office. So if you ever get into that situation, I just say get down there early and find out what their needs are, because they're not inclined to compromise.
Thank you. Vincent?
Yeah, as I said before, for the Habitat Bank in France, we are the landowner, so there is no problem of conservation covenants. But most of offset implementation in France is implemented directly by the project owners. That's what George called permittee responsible. At the moment, two types of implementations are used. In half of the cases, the project owners buy the land where offsets are implemented, and in the other cases, there are contracts between the project owners and the landowner, and there are no possibility in France now of conservation covenants for offset implementation. And those contracts are only contracts between two structures or two people, project owners and landowners. These contracts last from 1 to 9 years in extreme rare cases, with a mean duration of 3 or 4 years. So it is to be compared with offset duration that can reach 65 years. So at the end of the contract, the project owner has to negotiate another contract with the landowner. Any contractants can get out of the contract at any moment with only few consequences and financial consequences, but very, very few consequences, financial consequences, to get out of the contract. So this is a problem to ensure long-term management and long-term offset implementation. There is a new project of law about biodiversity, which is under construction now, and which should be voted by the French Parliament before the end of the year. And this project of law creates conservation covenants with biodiversity objectives. So it will be possible to do that for offset implementation. But by and large, the social acceptance of this conservation covenants is not very high in France, especially for agricultural land owners who doesn't like the name of servitude and the principle too. So there is questions about the risk to use these conservation covenants to implement offset, because it could reduce the social acceptance of offset, which is increasing since 2 or 3 years in France, but we still have difficulties to have a complete acceptance from agricultural landowners about offset. They say they have the double punishment, the impact of the project and offset implementations. So the use of these conservation covenants will have to be done with very, I don't know the word, but we have to do it with some care. Yeah. There is another question now, and we have to wait the final project of law, because the project we saw don't permit all French actors to use conservation covenants. The only actors that could use it are public actors or actors with public objectives. So in some cases, like for CDC Biodiversité, our job is, we are a private enterprise, our job is to implement offsets for project owners. And if this law is voted in this version, we will not be able to use conservation covenants, and we only can use contracts as today. So there are some questions, things are changing now, but we are not very sure about the effectiveness and the success of this method in France.
Great, thank you. And I think just before we get to a couple questions, so that maybe to answer the case, like what you were asking John earlier, there may be cases where in other countries where you don't have these kinds of laws, where you are looking at sort of long-term protection of an area, that some of the legal issues may be gazettement of an area to be protected, or using some of the laws to create that protection. What's important is to get, I think, really important to get the costing and the finances right too. I mean, if you asked George what a credit would be, he could give you the cost depending on which geography you were talking about, because a lot of it depends on land. In the case of Michael's in Australia, the landowner sets the price. Isn't that correct? And that's negotiated. And if you own a piece of very rare biodiversity, you may be a wealthy individual if you're selling your credit. And as Vincent said, the French government sets the price in France. But what would be the price of a credit if you were doing it in a place like Uganda, let's say? You know, well, then I think you'd have to look very carefully at what is the management cost of that area that you're protecting. When it wasn't a cost to manage it, what kind of investment in infrastructure, what kind of investment in monitoring that would need to happen, and then try to set up a cost of management, and then that would be the type of financing that would need to come over time to make sure that the success of that project. So it's really important to get the prices right so that you're covering those costs of conservation. So are there any questions about covenants, easements? Yes.
My name is Matt Raymond. I'm from ICF International, and we're doing some work for the European Commission at the moment. Thank you. Which is looking just at these types of mechanisms to ensure long-term sustainability of conservation benefits for offsets in the context of a no-net loss initiative. So I think this is really important if we are sort of working towards no-net loss.
Great.
I had a couple of quick questions. The first was that George talked very much about the importance of endowment funds in the US context, and I wondered if that was also, they are also required in Victoria and in France, and what experience there is of using them in those places. And secondly, it would be possible to envisage that even if you've got endowment funds which provide sort of expected resources for long-term management, that there could be a risk that things go wrong, that there are additional costs, that the offset provider goes out of business or whatever. And I wondered if you also require additional insurance or additional contingency funds sort of on top of that as well.
Let's start.
Thanks for that question. It's it's a difficult one when we start talking about the very long-term future in perpetuity. And how long is that, and what happens in 50 years' time? And I guess the best we can do is to set up things as best we can now, and trust that the future will do the right thing. In terms of endowments, in Victoria we don't have an endowment fund. The price is set by negotiation between the landowner and the developer. Now, at that point, the landowner is aware of all of their obligations, including management and protection of the offset in perpetuity. So the system assumes that the landowner has made their best judgment about factoring into their price provision for that obligation. So it's if you like, trusting the market. Now, I guess, it'll only be known in the very long term how well that's turned out. the question about default and other insurance and so on, our experience is that, like any agreement, there is a level of default. You know, it's like people default on their home mortgages, but it's relatively small. It's sort of like down around 3%, and we don't have a financial insurance arrangement to cover that, but we do use a safety factor in the gain calculation or in the no net loss calculation, so that, and it is loaded towards offsets of higher significance, but there is a factor which is, on average, probably turns out to be about 1.5 rather than 1, so that the gain is bigger than the loss. And this is designed to cover leakage, if you like, of a variety of causes. One being default on agreements, but you know, the other one being kind of natural disasters and other things that can cause the gain to be less than was strictly calculated. So yeah, so that's basically the insurance mechanism within our system.
Anyone else?
We don't have financial insurance. We take the financial risk for us, and we try to include it in the price of the biodiversity units or of our job to implement offset on demand. But that causes some offset implementations to be very expensive, especially in agricultural land where we have to deal with many risks, long-term risks. So in some cases that increases a lot the cost. But we don't have any insurance on that. That's part of the contracts between the developer and us.
Just briefly, you know, as I mentioned, we have financial assurances up to that 10 years, and we're held accountable until such time as the performance standards are met. So in the event we go belly up or go away, that's where the financial assurances kick in on that circumstance. The long-term stewardship only kicks in after that period of time when that property's been closed. So that could be 10 years afterwards. And in that instance, a management plan defines what are the management activities. And I will tell you, it doesn't cover every eventuality. I mean, it's not going to cover climate change. It's not going to cover hurricanes, droughts, and all those scenarios, because no long-term steward's going to be on the line forever to say, I'm going to control invasives forever. We couldn't quantify that, but we do our best to identify a management plan that then defines the total amount of the endowment, and then that is the cap of liability for that endowment manager, because that's an important issue. We're capping the liability and saying, you as the long-term steward are only accountable for what the monies are available that we've agreed to.
Hey, Tom, one more question. Go ahead, Tom.
We, like most people, share the ideal of in perpetuity management as an ideal. But I have 4 problems with it. 1, in this country we have no law to deliver it. 2, 98% of private landowners will not engage with it. 3, it makes the financial endowment prohibitively expensive and it kills the market. And 4, intellectually, you're asking for higher standards on compensation than you are for on-site mitigation. So for all of those reasons, it seems to me dangerous that BBOP and others demand in perpetuity as an absolute prerequisite for all offsets. I see it as being a very legitimate aspiration, but I think if you demand legal in perpetuity, you risk killing the scheme.
Just to clarify, in terms of what BBOP principles say, it's to last as long as the impact of the project, with a preferably in perpetuity. So I just wanted to clarify that. So
Tom, there's $3.5 billion a year of a market in the U.S. with perpetuity. So I guess my point is proof's in the pudding in the U.S. Now, you may not have, there may not be the legal vehicle for that, and I think that's an important issue. Your issue about, what 98% of the landowners don't agree, I've been hearing that all my life, and it's really about market value. You got to pay, you got to pay. And, but that's a wonderful thing because we're incenting landowners and conservation in a new way. We're paying more than developers in some instances for wetland mitigation. And that's a fantastic thing. And they'll agree to that. And you're not always taking all of their land either. And that's a big issue. The question on the endowments, we've been able to have reasonable approaches to that. It hasn't broke the bank yet. And then your question about higher standards for other forms of mitigation, that's where this equivalency comes into play. If you're permittee responsible, you've got to follow these same rules. And it's a really important issue. So that's one of the things that we've addressed. But I think the biggest issue around the world is are there legal protections that you can, a lot of countries don't allow for this. And then the question is, what can we use as an alternative to ensure?
Quickly, because we have to move on.
Yeah, Ray, I'll just comment on the 98% and agree with George that in our experience it has not been a impediment to sufficient supply, and I believe it is price sensitive. So I think if you up the price, you'd find it came down to 95. Doubled your price again, it'd be 85. So, it's a matter of, what's your price?
Great. We wanted to move on to the final section. I know we're running a little bit late, and one of it was to begin to discuss a little bit about some mechanisms, especially in developing countries that set up conservation trust funds, and what role they may play in terms of playing a financing role for biodiversity offsets. For those of you who aren't aware, conservation trust funds are independent entities, financial entities that finance conservation. And Luis is going to give a presentation a bit on Mozambique and the Biofund there. But they have independent boards. Oftentimes there are government representatives on their boards. They play a minority role. Today there are about 70 funds, conservation funds in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And capitalization is close to about $1 billion that are invested, and that money that is invested, the returns on those investments are used to finance different conservation activities, oftentimes dedicated to financing protected areas or community conservation initiatives. The funds are organized actually in different sort of networks. There's a network of Latin American funds that coordinate different activities. We have someone here from a fund in Colombia, actually. It's been here in this room. We have the CAFE, which is a group of African funds network, and then there's going to be a new Asian network that's being created. So these funds have a role. Now, someone asked about the permanence. Now, we don't have a lot of experience, but our oldest funds are about 20 years old. So they've been successful in, at least for like 20 years. We have a fund in Uganda that was created in 1994, reached 20 years this year. Last year, Peruvian fund was 20. So those experiences indicate that those funds, rather than suffering difficulties, have actually increased their value and their overall capital base. There's an organization called the Conservation Finance Alliance that's developed some practice standards to set best practice for the funds. And so there are opportunities. Trust funds, the conservation trust funds in Latin America, Africa, Asia, view themselves as potential useful third-party implementers for offsets. That is, managing the funds and then helping to oversee the compliance with the implementation of management plans. They're managing some funds for REDD already through REDD credits. They see biodiversity offset payments as a strong potential, and it offers an interesting opportunity. There's oftentimes a resistance for a private sector to push money through the government to pay for offsets. So having a third-party organization of independent, but also linked to the basic principles of what the government's trying to achieve, say, under the CBD, is very attractive. And so this helps develop an important public-private partnership for a local institution with government to be able to promote conservation outcomes. So with that just brief introduction, I wanted to invite Luis to do a presentation on some of the efforts in Mozambique to establish a fund there, and then we'll take some questions, I think before we have lunch. So thank you. Thanks for that.
Thanks very much, Roy. With this introduction, I think it's going to be easy for me to meet my 6 minutes limit, because most of what of importance EF funds does, I mean, it's said in your intervention. Well, in fact, we hope that environmental funds will have a role in this process of spreading a biodiversity offsets according to the principle of no-net loss. In the case of Mozambique, our fund we feel to be invited to play an extra role, which is that of working together with BIBOP, with the donor community and international ONGs to help jumpstart the process. And so, apart from playing, hopefully in the future, this role of helping to fund for perpetuity in preference, the offsets, we think that we also need to be somehow the conveners of this process, and we need to help study the prevailing circumstances so as to make sure that this process is well conducted. Well, this conversation takes us a bit to what we were discussing yesterday. And because of that, let me quote Jeff Manuel, who incidentally is not around, but he said at a certain stage that in order to find appropriate solution for the problems they were facing with, they needed to jump out of the BIBOP bus. But here in Mozambique, we feel that we need to catch the BIBOP bus to make sure that the appropriate answers to our problems are going to be met. Now, let me briefly, I'm not going to resort to the slides because this was going to take us too long. But let me briefly say that after the discussions we had yesterday, we understand that, in fact, offsets should intervene after the whole hierarchy of mitigation is exhausted. We can even say that perhaps more important than the offsets per se is the mitigating hierarchy to be observed, because most probably it's easier for an investor or development to volunteer to pay for offsets than to have them respecting or observing the hierarchy of mitigation. But in order to do so, legal framework, institutional capacity, and political will are other preconditions that need to be in place. The questions and the challenges are how to make sure that the proposed scheme sustains a no-net loss or even net gain measured against the residual damage of each of the projects targeted. And here, in fact, our stand and what I was going to develop if I had the slides, but in fact it was going to take us a little long. In the slides I was trying to make the case that in the circumstances like the one being experienced in countries like Mozambique, where on the one hand you have a reasonable system of protected areas. And in those protected areas, you have a good representation of most of your ecosystems and habitats. And on the other hand, you have an influx of investment and contracts, particularly related to the extractive industry. It makes sense to see the protected area system as the, yes, here you have the situation which is similar to things we have seen in Mongolia and in Kazakhstan, I'm sure in Uganda and elsewhere. This is where there is no Mozambique. There are contracts and some protected areas. And so this is the urgency of some action to make sure that something is done, I mean, to ensure that conservation accompanies, I mean, the influx of investments and the need of our governments to respond to the pressure of these investors, perhaps by overlooking some of the demands of good practices. So if we elect the protected areas as the recipients par excellence of the offsets, then perhaps the challenges would be to ask who would be there to make sure in the units which are the protected areas, to make sure that the mapping, the quantifying, the costing, all the operations that need to be done before you consider discussing the actual practice, I mean, with an investor or with a developer to constitute an offset. Who is going to do this? Is this going to be done by the individual protected areas? Is this going to be done by the authority overseeing the system? Is it going to be done by the ministry in charge of environmental affairs? Is it going to be done by other sectors of the government, like the Ministry for Industry or the Minister for Mineral Resources or Agriculture, for that matter? So we think that to engage in a process where we're going to bring together, I mean, all the governmental players, the investors, and the private sector in countries like Mozambique, together with BBOP and other partners, to make sure that we're going to perform the initial steps in this process in a assured manner, in accordance with international standards. It's the only way of ensuring, I mean, this landscape planning rather than a scattered answer to the challenge that we are facing. So this is perhaps what would complement what your introduction to the theme.
Thank you, Luis. And I think Luis presented an interesting point here. Offsets in protected areas. One of the things that has been raised a couple times in our discussions is the issue of additionality. And is it additional to go ahead and carry out offsets in areas that are already protected? What if, as in the case of Mozambique, only 35% of the funding needed for the management of those protected areas is available from the government, and most of that from donors? Can offsets then therefore be additional if they fund protected areas? And I think those are some of the questions that we're going to need to be looking at and answering. I'm not expecting you to answer it today, but it are certainly things that will be our challenges in going forward with implementation of offsets. Any questions related to the trust fund discussion? Yes, Ben.
Perhaps just a comment. In the context of the work we're doing, I would hope that long-term view that we can have a trust fund that serves to fund not offset activities, but higher or lower in the hierarchy, to have enhancements to existing protected areas. And I hope that the trust fund is the vehicle to do that. So maybe the Mozambican experience is relevant.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Kina?
So I just wanted to mention two things. One is that one of our sort of proposed offset strategies in Mongolia is actually to strengthen protected area management. So there's that. And then my other question actually is with these conservation funds, are the funds actually investing in other things, so increasing, their capital by investing in different commodities in order to raise more money, or is it just sort of like people putting, money into these funds, or businesses putting money into the funds?
Do you want to answer? I'm happy to do it.
Well, normally we raise funds to have an endowment, and this endowment is invested internationally, and the revenue of this investment is what is returned to the country to pay for the protected areas for our programs, in fact.
Do you have like requirements for what you will invest in and what you won't invest in? Are you only investing in sort of green products, green, sorts of things?
Yes, there are very strict rules, or recommendations in this regard. In fact, the process well, we have an investment committee, which normally is comprised of people who are knowledgeable in this sector. And then there is a process of a selection of an asset manager, an international asset manager, and this needs to be in accordance with the donors. They need to agree with this process. And so the areas where we invest are really very carefully monitored, and the practices are really conservative. That's why really it's very little the money that we perceive from these investments. But this is the practice, and this is what we... Of course, apart from those investments, we also handle, sinking funds, funds which are directed to particular programs that are identified in the country.
Yes. Some of the funds apply social and environmental screens to their investments. Asset allocation tends to be relatively conservative because the idea is preserving capital. What we've been doing since 2007 is an annual assessment of the returns of the funds. So we have a database now that runs from 2007 now to 2012 that indicates returns. And basically, if you, on average, funds the last 5 years have been earning about 6.8, 7% across all the different funds, which, given the climate, has not been too bad. Any other questions? Oh, George.
I just had a question and maybe a comment. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. Really what we're talking about is offsets are very contextual, and we have to understand, where we are and how we do these things. And to Tom's point, sometimes the BBOP standards may or may not apply appropriately. But I will say this, as it relates to, one thing that's often lost is this notion of, as soon as we go down the slippery slope of basically funding protected areas, which should have been funded otherwise, but we know is underfunded, that the government will never fund it again. So that's one thing you're losing. And then the second thing is, it becomes a government kind of mandated approach to offsets. And the beauty of the U.S. model, as an example, is that we've leveraged the private dollars in ways that because we did not go these routes where we're only going to protected areas and the government runs it and it's only on government lands, we have standards that leverage the opportunity for private investment. And I think that can be lost even in these areas that can't meet all the standards. So I'd welcome your guys' thoughts on that.
Well, I agree that it is a slippery slope. Ideally, there would be better financial planning, and there'd be a lot of more funding for protected areas. But if you look at a history of 20 years of funding for protected areas, and those areas have never been fully funded, the likelihood that they would be becomes much more, is really quite limited. So I think there's a question of at what point or what percentage. Maybe there's a rule in some kind of system that's put in place that up to a certain point there's support for protected areas. I think it should not be at the expense of looking at other protection. As I said earlier in the discussion, the opportunity to work with villagers, to work with private landowners, to work with communities who who have forests that could be managed for conservation, we shouldn't lose those opportunities. And so having a mix of investments that go along with your offsets, to me, would make much better sense than say we're going to plug everything into a protected area, or we're not going to fund protected areas at all. I think it is contextual, and I think that finding that kind of balance within that context would be very important. That's at least my opinion on that. There's a question?
Hi. I work for ArcelorMittal Liberia, and I just wanted to say I agree with what you said, because we have a protected area actually in our concession. It was established 10 years ago. Since then, it's had no management plan. The government has not put, or has put minimal resources into it, and doesn't have any extra resources to put into its management. So as part of our offsetting strategy, we're looking at funding or helping to support and improve the management of that reserve. And we're also working with the community forests in the area as well, supporting them to manage their forests. And I think, yes, you're right, for the protected areas, the government should be doing that. But at the moment, they don't have those resources, and we're going to be there for at least another 20 years. We've got the resources to help support and improve the management of that protected area and those community forests. So why can't we do that? I think it's a good thing.
Okay, thank you. Well, great. I think we've passed our time. I'm very sorry. Thank you very much for attending. I think it's been a good discussion. I think it's really important to keep in mind this permanence issue. I also, there are different ways that we can finance and looking at these costs of implementation of offset. So we need to look at these mechanisms. I think George's last point here on the context of that is very, very important. Thank you very much, and enjoy your lunch.